Australia, our friendly neighbor south of the equator. Geographically isolated, Australia has been the home of unique flora and fauna for millennia. As such, interaction between native and foreign species has often bred ecological problems for the Australian government. Today, we delve into a wholly unique event in Australian history, an event that was perhaps the most volatile conflict between Australian natives and foreign species. We analyze today the historic battle between proud native Australians, the emus, and a destructive foreign menace, the Australian military.
On January 26, 1788, Captain Arthur Phillip led 11 British ships to the colony of New South Wales, otherwise known as the continent of modern-day Australia. Arthur was initially employed to create an agricultural penal colony for Britain's excess convicts. However, when Arthur first began to establish the colony, obstacles such as poor soil and the unfamiliar landscape prevented the Europeans from settling in comfortably. Additionally, conflicts with the indigenous Aborigines of the area prevented the British colonists from finding solutions to their farming problems. 2 centuries later, the Australian continent is composed of 6 different colonies: Van Diemen's Land, Western Australia, South Australia, Victoria, Queensland, and the Northern Territory, all combined within a federation under a democratic Commonwealth Parliament. Although Australia was considered to be part of the British Empire until January 1, 1901, when the nation became an independent nation under the Democratic Federation of the Commonwealth Parliament, the state would still hold its ties to the British Empire by respecting Queen Victoria as their head of state. Regardless of the most part, Australia had become a self-governing federal state, creating its own constitution and legislative system. At the dawn of World War I, during the months before 1914, Australia began to bolster its defenses by creating its own navy in order to defend itself from Japan and Germany. During the war, volunteers from the Australian Imperial Force gathered as militia groups to support the British on the Western Front as well as on the sea. However, as the war was extended to an unprecedented period of time, fewer fighters joined the cause, and a conscription was needed in order to supply the necessary amount of troops for the Australian Imperial Force. By 1918, Australian recruitment and war effort was significantly diminished as the day-to-day difficulties of wartime life caught up with the general populace. As a result, by the end of World War I, many Australian veterans were disillusioned with the Australian government, making reintegration to normal life difficult.
In order to ease the transition for its soldiers from wartime to normalcy, Australia created the Repatriation Department to help returning veterans from the Great War get back on their feet. In many cases, a lot of these veterans decided to take advantage of Australia's vast land and low population density and start their own agriculture. As a result, many Australians moved to the regions such as Campion and Walgoolan to start planting wheat and sustaining themselves for their new life. However, the returning soldiers would find it difficult to sustain themselves, for they had failed to account for one thing: approximately 20,000 emus with a score to settle. Enter the emu, the second largest living bird and a prehistoric relic native to Australia. These birds had thrived all over the continent since Dreamtime, where they were conservatively hunted by Australian Aborigines. The birds were used for food and clothing, but were never hunted to excess. Emus were given relatively free rein over the continent and subsisted on small grasses and shrubs without causing trouble to the Aborigines. Enter some crotchety Australian war veterans. The returning members of the Australian Imperial Force set up a system of fences to cordon off their own land and farms. These fences disrupted the normal feeding patterns of the emus in Campion, who were then forced to eat the crops of the veterans. Thus, due to a disruption of normal emu activity by humans, the humans came to the conclusion that emus were a virulent pest that had to be eradicated.
On November 2nd, 1932, under the direction of the Australian Minister of Defence, 2 Lewis machine guns, 10,000 bullets, and 2 gunners under the command of Major G.P.W. Meredith were sent to Campion for the purpose of eliminating the emu pest. The soldiers met with little success and only a few birds were dispatched. On November 4th, the small battalion met with similar failures after experiencing technical problems after killing only a dozen emus, and then completely failing to hit a single bird after pursuit in an armored car. During interviews about how his trained military team could fail to produce substantial results in the fight against the emus, Major Meredith is reported as having said, "If we had a military division with the bullet-carrying capacity of these birds, it would face any army in the world. They can face machine guns with the invulnerability of tanks. They are like Zulus, whom even dum-dum bullets could not stop." These failures made up just a single attempt at emu eradication. In the months that followed, more expeditions, all headed by Major Meredith, would venture out and be met with similar defeats. When hostilities officially ceased on December 10th, 1932, it was found that for the 9,860 bullets fired, only 986 emus were killed. Over the next 20 years, the still struggling farmers called for continued military action against the birds, but were rebuffed by the Australian government, which was wary of repeating the embarrassment of total failure against some flightless birds.
In 1953, after decades of struggling to sustain the growth of crops against the emu hordes, a plan was approved by the Western Australia State Cabinet to build a 135-mile-long emu-proof fence in order to contain the pest. Nothing since the 1932 Lewis gun expedition failure had given the Australian farmers as much hope as the proposed fence. However, an Australian newspaper, the Sydney Herald, asserted that the fence would not be a final victory, for the emus carried with them all the hardiness of the cruel, sparse environment of the emu's origin, the Australian Sand Plains.
The Great Emu War, as the attempts to eradicate the emu pest came to be called, was simply put a farce. It stood for the complete lack of foresight and the ineptness of the Australian government to lend real aid to their struggling populace. However, it also stands for the continuing impact of human development on the natural world. A country's ecological footprint is the sum of all the cropland, grazing land, forest, and fishing grounds required to produce the food, fiber, and timber it consumes. As a result of the Emu War, Australia's ecological footprint increased due to the government's active efforts to increase the land available to farm, while at the same time decreasing the land available to the emus. This occurrence was one of many in a long line of Australian ecological oversights that continue to this day.
In 1925, prickly pear cactus was introduced to Queensland, Australia in order to jumpstart a cochineal industry. Cochineal is a red dye made from bugs that feed on the cactus. The cactus soon came to be classified as a weed and grew over nearly the entire continent, displacing native species and requiring the import of another non-native insect to eradicate the cactus. In 1935, the cane toad was introduced to Australia in attempts to cull a population of beetles that were eating crops. An unforeseen consequence of the introduction of this species was that a toxin the toads secreted can kill most of the natural predators of frogs and toads in Australia. Containment of this pest continues to be an issue today. In the 1800s, feral cats were introduced by British colonists, and the cat population exploded, resulting in the extinction of a few species of ground birds and small rodents. Due to the growing pest, the Australian government has plans to kill 2 million of the animals by 2020, a decision that has been met with strong backlash from animal support groups. In addition to its many problems with invasive species, the Australian government is ignoring many threats to the biologically diverse Great Barrier Reef occurring in local waters, such as pollution and excess noise from ships that is harming the native creatures. In short, the Australian government's attempts to develop their geographically isolated continent have disrupted the delicate balance of Australia's many ecosystems.
Australia has long been the site of ecological disasters, most notably and humorously, the so-called Great Emu War. It was only in the Great Emu War that Australia began to see such active involvement from its government in ecological destruction. All this came about because of the conflict with one animal, one observed as early as 1696, whose giant footprint was most frightening to observe. This animal, in all of its gangly, feathered glory, all of its seemingly bulletproof feathers, all of its relentless terrorization of Australian farmers was the emu.
Emu!